Hello everyone, we're going to take the 2013 HSA practice test. This video is to talk about session 1. For the first question, they're asking which of these is a characteristic of the United States system of government. System of government is another way of saying if it's federalism, unitary, or confederation. Now the United States is a federal government, which means that there is a national or central and local or state government at the bottom. Because of that, the correct answer is D. The powers of government are divided between the national and state governments. For number 2, it says, read the excerpt below. No business shall discriminate against a qualified individual with a disability in regard to job application procedures, the hiring, advancement, or discharge, firing of employees. That's from the Americans with Disabilities Act. What this act tried to do is it tried to create equal opportunity for everyone, regardless of any disabilities or handicaps they might have. We know that that answer is F, social equality, because we're trying to create equality within society, or social equality. Number 3. Which of these was an effect of the Supreme Court decision in McCulloch versus Maryland? In McCulloch versus Maryland, we talked about 2 things. The first one was the Supremacy Clause, which states that the federal government is more powerful than the state government if they disagree. The other thing it talked about was the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says that Congress can expand their powers in order to basically get their job done to create any other laws related to their powers in the Constitution. So we have Supremacy Clause and Elastic Clause. Up here we see that it's not A, because that's talking about the 6th Amendment. It's not B, because that's talking about Plessy versus Ferguson. C is talking about the Supremacy Clause, which says that state laws conflicting or disagreeing with federal laws are unconstitutional. And D is incorrect because D is talking about the opposite of the Elastic Clause. For number 4, number 4 is asking us what guarantees people have if they're accused of crime. One of the things that they're guaranteed is a lawyer. They're guaranteed a fair jury. They're guaranteed a public and speedy trial. But they're also guaranteed the right to know what the charges are that are against them. So that means if they were arrested for committing murder, they have to be told that they're arrested for committing murder. That means the correct answer is G. Number 5. Which of these is a goal of a state law? To reduce air and water pollution. We know that it's not A. We know that it's not B. Both of those are talking about the economy. We know that's not C because it's not protecting someone's right to do something. We know that it's D because the health, someone's ability to breathe, is very strongly related to pollution. So D is the correct answer for number 5. For number 6, we need to think about the legislative branch for this one. If a state's population declined or decreased over time, that does not affect their funding from Congress, and if it did, it would decrease the funding instead of increase. It would reduce the representation in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is based on a state's population. The more population, the more representatives they have. If a state declines in population, they decline in their representatives as well. It's not H, because H talks about the Senate, and every state has 2 senators, and the number of electors in the Electoral College is actually lower if the state's population is lower. So the correct answer is G for number 6. Number 7, government fines companies for failing to correct hazardous machine parts. This one is talking about trying to protect people. If you have a hazardous or dangerous machine, then that could hurt the people who work in those machines or with those machines. And that one would be to be A, to protect workers from injury. We know it's not B because that's not talking about teaching or education. We know it's not C because they aren't creating new parts, they're just replacing them. And is not D because they're not talking about unemployment. So the correct answer is A. For number 8, which of these would be most likely be involved in resolving a border dispute between China and Vietnam? And this is something we talked about last class. We know it's not J because the North American Free Trade Agreement is between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Vietnam and China are not part of those. We know it's not the International Red Cross because they just provide medical care and supplies in emergencies. We know it's not G, which is NATO or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because that's a treaty between Europe, countries in Europe, and countries in North America. China and Vietnam are on a different continent. And so that leaves us with F, the United Nations, which is like the international government that goes across and tries to settle disagreements and disputes between two or more countries. So the correct answer is F. Number 9. This one, we want to study the chart below, and we see interest rate, and we know that that's that's something that is charged to banks when they borrow money from the Federal Reserve. The reserve requirements are the amount of money banks must have in reserve. Basically, they need to have that in their safe or their vault. And open market operations are when the government or when people can sell and buy securities from the U.S. government. Basically, people can invest in the U.S. government. And so we have a couple different options, and it says which of these would be a result of open market operations by the Federal Reserve System. So we want to make sure we're looking in this section, the bottom section, open market, look at the function. Based on this, we want to think about what happens when people buy or sell government securities. If we buy securities, that means we're spending money and our money supply decreases. If our money supply decreases, we have less money to spend. That changes the money supply. If we sell securities, then that increases our money supply because we have more money. That also would change our money supply. So the correct answer is D. We also know it's not C because they don't talk about hours of banks. We know it's not B because they aren't talking anything about currency. And we know that it's not A because A says decrease, and we don't really know how that would be affected based on this chart. So the correct answer is D. For number 10, this one is a constructed response, so you actually want to write a paragraph or so answering this. The quote says, it would usually take 100 years to make a law, and then after it has done its work, it usually takes 100 years to get rid of it. The answer is, do you agree or disagree with this quote about the lawmaking process? So do you agree that it takes a long time to make a law, and then the effects of the law also take a long time before they're gone? Or do you believe that it's much faster to create laws and to change laws? You need to make sure that when you write this, you explain why you agree or disagree. The second question is saying, how could the lawmaking process be improved? And again, you want to make sure that you explain your answer. You could say it can be improved by getting more people's opinions or ideas. it could be improved because we're going to decrease the amount of time it takes to write a law, or some other different ideas that you have, whatever you think we could do to improve the lawmaking process. For number 11, which of these is an example of separation of powers? The first one, representatives rewrite a bill in committees. That's talking only about the legislative branch. It's not talking about the different powers between the legislative, judicial, and executive. The second one, representatives hold hearings to hear public opinion. Again, that's just talking about the legislative branch. It doesn't talk about the other ones. Letter C talks about the president and Congress, which are in two different branches, the legislative and the executive. Congress is the legislative, president's executive. And D talks about just a president who fires a cabinet member who's also in the executive branch. Because of that, we know that A, B, and D are wrong. The only correct answer is C, because it talks about the executive branch and the legislative branch, president and Congress. Number 12. This one is talking about business competition, as we want to think about who monitors or regulates businesses. We know it's not F, because F is talking about airplanes. Aviation and airplanes are the same thing. The Federal Communications Commission, that one is talking about the radio, television, internet, and regulating those different areas. We know it's not H, which talks about the environment, so regulating fuel, pollution, and all of that. So that leaves us with J, the Federal Trade Commission. And the way to think about it or remember it is trade. The word trade right here basically means a type of business or engaging in business where you buy something or sell something. So what they do is they try to oversee and make sure businesses are being competitive and there's not a monopoly. So J is the correct answer. In which of these circumstances will a judge grant a writ of habeas corpus? Remember, habeas corpus means bring the body to court. And when we're talking about bringing the body to court, we're talking about bringing it so it can talk to or appear before a judge. And that's usually just in criminal cases. So, let's see. Negligence. Well, all of these could be criminal cases, but negligence wouldn't work because they know they're being charged with negligence. So that's not correct. B, the accused person is being held without cause. They're being held without having heard why they're being accused. That is a good example of why a judge would grant a writ of habeas corpus, because they want the person to appear before the judge, either to get charged with the crime or to be released from jail. So the correct answer is B for number 13. For number 14, it's asking which of these describes federalism. Remember, federalism talks about the states and the national government sharing or dividing their power. For letter F, that's talking about the judicial power, which talks more about judicial review or separation of powers. G, the powers not delegated to the states by the Constitution are reserved to the states. So that means the powers for the United States are here, and if it's not here, then it's given to the states. And so we're dividing the power between the national government and the state governments. So the correct answer is, in fact, G. And number 15, Tinker versus Des Moines. That one is talking about student speech in a school. What happened is there were these students who wore these black armbands to protest a war, and they got in trouble with the school, and it went to the Supreme Court. During this time, the Supreme Court said that you have the freedom of speech in school as long as it does not interrupt your learning. So we know that it's not A, because it doesn't matter what your opinion is. It's not B, because it doesn't matter if the school board agrees or disagrees. It's not C, because we can't give certain privileges to people with good grades compared to not good grades. So the correct answer is D. There is a lack of evidence that the student's actions disrupted learning. If there's not enough evidence, that means there's a lack of evidence. And there wasn't enough evidence that said that it disrupted learning or stopped learning. So the correct answer is D. Number 16. Number 16 says that no free man shall be taken or imprisoned unless by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. So now we want to think about which of these constitutional principles or rights from the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments, is supported by that quote. The right to petition the government is when someone asks the government to do something. The quote is talking about being imprisoned. So it wouldn't be that. The right to vote, the quote doesn't talk about voting either. The right to trial by jury. So who judges people if they're going to be guilty or not guilty? It's a jury. The jury says if you're guilty or not guilty. What that means is that this quote right up here talks about being judged guilty or not guilty. The right to trial by jury is when the jury decides if you're guilty or not guilty. That means H is a correct answer. Which of these is the main economic cost of the federal government removing taxes on imported goods? So if you remove taxes on imports, that makes it easier to import more items, bringing items in from one country into the other country. If we decrease taxes, it'll be cheaper to do that. So some of the possibilities are the goods will be cheaper, but it also means that if a country can make that good for a lower price, it might be cheaper to make it in that country than in the United States. That means the people in the United States might go out of business because those other goods are cheaper. So what that means is C is the correct answer. A reduction in the ability of the United States businesses to compete with foreign companies. D is the correct answer. Number 18. Why do some nations adopt command economies during wars? A command economy is when the government controls the entire economy. They decide what to do and when to do it, all of that. Based on these questions, during a war, we're not trying to increase the standard of living. We are not trying to discourage the growth of monopolies. What we are trying to do is win the war. And in order to win the war, we're not going to spend money on making pencils. We're not going to spend money on making cars. Instead, we're going to spend money making bullets. We're going to spend money making planes or tanks or other weapons. And it's not to satisfy the demand for consumer goods. So the answer is H, to focus resources on essential industries. So the next one is a constructed response. And so we need to talk about what the question's asking us. We have two maps right here. When you're doing this, if you see the two maps, what I suggest that you do first is go down and read the questions first. The first question says, explain how the problems faced by the local governments, the metropolitan areas of Maryland, differ from those in other regions of the state. Then it says which problem is most critical, explain why. So what the first question is asking, what are some problems that local governments face in metropolitan or city areas, so in this dark area, that are different from these other areas, especially the ones with these slanted lines? Why do you think they have different problems? Some of the problems you could have for this are, in cities, they have more roads, they have more population, which means they have to have taller buildings, they have to have apartments, sky rises, those kinds of things. They also might have to have more schools or bigger schools to serve their community. Meanwhile, the other areas that are less populated might have other problems, such as problems about farming or forestry, so working with the woods or the forests over in this area of Maryland. And they don't really necessarily have cities or big cities that have a big population. And then you're also going to have to give your opinion answer, which is which problem is most critical. So is creating roads or apartments more critical than providing resources for farming? It's up to you to decide. We now have just a few more questions in this section. The first one is study the political cartoon below, then answer numbers 20 and 21. If we look at the question, which of these does the cartoon suggest occurs as a result of media predictions of election results? So we can look at the map, of the cartoon, and you can see that it says, you don't have to vote, Sam. The networks predicted the winner 3 hours ago. When they talk about the networks, they're talking about the news. They're talking about the media who say, we think this person won. And what the wife in this picture is saying is, she's telling her husband that he does not have to vote because they already know who won, so his vote doesn't matter. So, if his vote doesn't matter, does that mean that the polling place is closed already? That candidates withdraw or quit? Networks give different information about candidates? Or citizens are discouraged from going to the polls? If he thinks his vote doesn't matter, does he still want to go vote? Probably not. So that would be J. Citizens are discouraged from going to the polls. Now for question 21. With which of these statements would the cartoonist most likely agree? The media should stop covering elections, which means to stop talking about it at all. B. The voters should be aware of voting trends on election day, so how people are voting and why. C. The media should wait until all polls close, until all voting is done, before projecting the winner. Or D. Voters should stop voting for candidates who advertise on television. The political cartoon talks about the media, or talks about the news. That means we can get rid of B, and we can get rid of D. So we're between A and C. A is talking about everything overall, and C is talking about projecting the winner. In the cartoon, they talk about projecting the winner and how it is a bad thing. So C, media should wait until all polls close before projecting the winners, is the correct answer. And 22. Which of these is a power reserved for state governments by the United States Constitution? So we're thinking about what can states do that the federal government cannot do. Coining money. Is money from the United States or from different states? If you have a dollar bill, is it a Maryland dollar or a US dollar? It's a US dollar because the national government has the power to coin money. Is there a Maryland Army or a US Army? Is there a Maryland Navy or a U.S. Navy? And we know that it's the United States who has a military, so we know that G is also incorrect. J, the power to make treaties with foreign countries, that's another power that the United States has that the state governments do not have. So the only answer left is H, the power to establish public schools. This one is correct, and if you think about it, every school that you go to, that you've been to in the United States, is created or established either by a local government or by the state government. That's the end of session 1. If you have any other questions, please let me know. I will be here to answer any questions you have. Have a good day.